power is a fragile illusion. People who sit in glass penthouses forget how easily a single stone can shatter their world. Tonight, a ruthless billionaire thought he was stepping on a nobody, a faceless server in a sea of white tablecloths, by leaving a deeply insulting $1 tip on a $15,000 bill. He wanted to break her. He wanted the entire dining room to watch a struggling woman crumble under the weight of his bottomless arrogance. But Richard Croft chose the wrong woman to humiliate, because that crumpled piece of paper was about to cost him his empire. The air inside l'Orchidée always smelled of wealth, a heady, intimidating blend of white truffles, aged oak, and the faint metallic tang of cold, hard cash. Located on the top floor of a gleaming Manhattan high-rise, the restaurant was an absolute fortress of exclusivity. Reservations were booked years in advance, and the clientele consisted solely of hedge fund managers, tech moguls, and old-money aristocrats who viewed the staff not as human beings, but as pieces of the lavish furniture. For Chloe Matthews, the restaurant was a gilded cage. She stood near the mahogany service station, her black uniform pressed to absolute perfection, her hair pulled back into a severe, invisible bun. Her feet, encased in sensible black shoes, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. She had been on her feet for 10 hours straight. To the wealthy patrons sipping their cristal, Chloe was just another ghost hovering at the edge of their peripheral vision, a vessel to carry their caviar and pour their wine. They didn't know that 3 years ago, Chloe was a rising forensic accountant. They didn't know she had graduated at the top of her class from Wharton, or that her father, Arthur Matthews, had once owned a successful logistics firm before he was driven to bankruptcy and an early grave by a corporate raider. They certainly didn't know that she had taken this soul-crushing job specifically to disappear. "Matthews," a sharp voice hissed. It was David, the floor manager. His face was flushed, a sheen of panic settling over his forehead. "Table 4. Now." Chloe blinked, snapping back to reality. "Table 4? I thought that was reserved for the mayor's party." "The mayor got bumped," David said, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "Richard Croft just walked through the private elevator. He has 5 guests with him. I need my best server on this, Chloe, no mistakes. He is notorious for getting staff fired. He once bought a restaurant in London just to fire a sommelier who disagreed with him about a Bordeaux. You are perfect. You are invisible. Keep his glass full and keep your mouth shut." Chloe's heart stopped. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the clinking of crystal, the soft hum of string music, seemed to instantly evaporate, replaced by a deafening ringing in her ears. Richard Croft. She slowly turned her head toward the center of the dining room. There he was. The man was a shark in a bespoke charcoal suit. He moved with a terrifying, predatory grace, his silver-streaked hair swept back, his dark eyes scanning the room with absolute disdain. He was the CEO of Croft Holdings, a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm known for buying vulnerable companies, gutting their assets, destroying thousands of pensions, and leaving the hollowed-out shells to rot. He was also the exact man who had orchestrated the hostile takeover of her father's company. He was the architect of her family's ruin. A cold, terrifying calm washed over Chloe. She had spent 3 years burying the anger, nursing her sick mother on a waitress's salary, hiding from the corporate world that had chewed her family up. And now, the devil himself was sitting in her section. "I'll handle it," Chloe said, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Water first," David instructed, practically shoving a silver tray into her hands. "Sparkling, room temperature, no ice. Go." As Chloe approached table 4, she observed the entourage. Croft was flanked by people who looked equally ruthless. To his right sat Jonathan Hayes, a notoriously corrupt real estate developer whose latest project had displaced hundreds of low-income families. To his left was Penelope Vane, a socialite whose wealth was built on overseas sweatshops. They were laughing loudly, an obnoxious, braying sound that cut through the refined atmosphere of the restaurant. "I told the idiot if he wants to keep his job, he'll take a 30% pay cut," Croft was saying, swirling a glass of pre-dinner scotch. "These people don't understand leverage. They think loyalty pays the bills. Fear pays the bills." "Brilliant, Richard. Absolutely brutal," Jonathan chuckled, taking a sip of his drink. Chloe stepped up to the table. She moved with practiced grace, pouring the sparkling water into the crystal goblets without making a single sound. She kept her eyes averted, playing the part of the subservient ghost perfectly. "Good evening," Chloe murmured, her voice steady. "Welcome to Lorkide. My name is Chloe, and I will be taking care of you tonight. May I start you off with some appetizers while you review the tasting menu?" Richard Croft stopped talking. He slowly turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto her. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her name tag, then slowly dragged his gaze up and down her uniform, as if inspecting a minor imperfection on a new car. "Chloe," he said, testing the name on his tongue like it tasted bitter. "Tell me, Chloe, do you know what a truffled langoustine is?" "Yes, sir," she replied evenly. "It is a Norway lobster, poached in butter, served with a shaving of Alba white truffle and a delicate bisque." Croft let out a patronizing sigh, leaning back in his chair. "Fascinating. She can read the menu. But can she actually ensure it reaches my table before the truffles lose their aroma? The last time I was here, the service was embarrassingly pedestrian. If I wanted to wait for my food, I'd eat at a diner in Queens." Penelope giggled behind her hand. Jonathan smirked. Chloe felt a familiar, burning spike of rage in her chest, but she forcefully pushed it down. She had survived worse than the fragile ego of a billionaire bully. "I assure you, Mr. Croft, the service will be flawless." "We'll see," Croft muttered, turning away from her as if she had suddenly ceased to exist. "Bring us the Osetra caviar to start, and send the sommelier. I don't trust a waitress to handle a proper vintage." Chloe offered a polite, hollow nod. "Right away, sir." As she walked back toward the kitchen, her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from a deeply suppressed adrenaline. The ghost of Arthur Matthews was standing beside her, and the ghosts of her past were screaming. But Chloe breathed in the scent of white truffles and money, and she formulated a plan. She was going to give Richard Croft the best service of his life. She was going to give him enough rope to hang himself. The dinner service devolved into a 2-hour psychological torture session. Richard Croft didn't just want to eat. He wanted to perform. He used his wealth and status as a weapon, and tonight, Chloe was his chosen target practice. It was a sadistic game meant to amuse his guests and assert his total dominance over the environment. It started with the wine. Even though the sommelier had poured a breathtakingly expensive bottle of 1982 Chateau Margaux, Croft insisted that Chloe be the one to refill their glasses. Every time she approached the table, he would find a reason to humiliate her. "Look at her posture," Croft remarked loudly to Jonathan as Chloe leaned in to pour the wine. "Slouched, defeated. This is the posture of the working class. They carry the weight of their own mediocrity on their shoulders." Jonathan barked a laugh. "You're terrible, Richard." "I'm observant," Croft corrected, taking a sip of the red wine and immediately grimacing. He slammed the delicate crystal glass onto the table, the dark red liquid splashing over the rim and staining the pristine white tablecloth like a drop of blood. "Matthews," Croft barked, snapping his fingers at her. "What is this?" "It is the 82 Margot, sir," Chloe said, stepping forward. "It's corked," he lied. "It tastes like wet cardboard. Did you shake the bottle before you brought it out? Did you let it sit near the heat lamps? You've ruined a $5,000 bottle of wine with your absolute incompetence." Chloe knew for a fact the wine was flawless. The sommelier had tasted it. Croft was simply bored and wanted to flex his power. "I apologize, sir. I will have the sommelier fetch another bottle immediately." "Don't bother," Croft sneered. "Just clean up this mess. You're ruining my appetite." He gestured to the drops of wine on the tablecloth. Chloe stood there for a fraction of a second, the entire restaurant watching. Diners at nearby tables had stopped eating, their eyes darting between the furious billionaire and the stoic waitress. David, the manager, was watching from the corner, his face pale, terrified to intervene and risk Croft's wrath. With measured, deliberate movements, Chloe retrieved a white linen cloth. She stepped up to the table and began to dab at the spilled wine. As she wiped the table, Croft deliberately shifted his elbow, knocking a silver butter knife off the table. It clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. "Pick it up," Croft commanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. Penelope Vane shifted uncomfortably in her seat, realizing that the game was crossing a line from playful snobbery into outright cruelty. But Jonathan Hayes was watching with a twisted grin. Chloe slowly knelt down, her knees pressing into the hard floor. Her fingers closed around the cold silver of the knife. In that vulnerable position, looking up at Croft's polished Italian leather shoes, the reality of the wealth disparity hit her like a physical blow. This was how he had treated her father. This was how he treated everyone. He forced them to their knees, stripped them of their dignity, and laughed while they scrambled for the scraps. She stood back up, placing the knife on her tray. "Is there anything else, sir?" she asked, her voice tight but remarkably steady. Croft looked almost disappointed that she hadn't cried. "Just bring the bill. We're done here." 10 minutes later, Chloe approached the table with a black leather folder. The total was astronomical. Between the imported caviar, the Wagyu beef, the truffles, and the multiple bottles of rare wine, the bill came to exactly $15,420. She placed the folder gently on the table next to Croft's right hand. "Your check, Mr. Croft. Thank you for dining at Lorchidee." Croft didn't even look at the itemized receipt. He pulled a sleek, black, titanium American Express card from his breast pocket and dropped it onto the leather tray. Chloe processed the payment in silence, returning with the final slip for his signature. This was the moment. The custom in such high-end establishments was a minimum of 20%, which would have been a tip of over $3,000, money that Chloe desperately needed for her mother's upcoming surgery. But as she handed him the pen, she saw a wicked, predatory gleam in his eye. Croft signed his name with a violent flourish. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a money clip thick with $100 bills. He bypassed the hundreds, his fingers digging deep into the center of the clip. He pulled out a single, crumpled, faded $1 bill. With agonizing slowness, Croft smoothed the $1 bill out on the table. He placed it squarely on top of the black leather folder. The silence at table 4 was deafening. Even Jonathan Hayes stopped smiling. Croft stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He looked down at Chloe, his eyes burning with malicious triumph. He raised his voice, ensuring that the tables surrounding them could hear every single word. "I believe in tipping based on the quality of the individual, not the quality of the food," Croft announced loudly. $1 for your thoughts, Chloe. But given your station in life and your pathetic performance tonight, I'd say even a single dollar is drastically overpaying you. Buy yourself a cup of cheap coffee. It's all you'll ever be worth." He waited for the tears. He waited for her to break. He thrived on the moment a person's spirit snapped, that beautiful, tragic second when they realized they were utterly powerless against him. He wanted to see her lip tremble. He wanted her to run to the kitchen in shame. Instead, the corners of Chloe's mouth twitched. The silence in Lorchidee was absolute. The gentle scrape of forks against porcelain had ceased entirely. Waitstaff froze mid-step. Every eye in the dining room was glued to the incredibly tense standoff at table 4. The cruelty of the act hung in the air, thick and suffocating. A $15,000 dinner and a $1 tip meant to strip a woman of her last shred of humanity. Chloe stood perfectly still, looking at the faded face of George Washington, staring back at her from the black leather folder. She didn't cry. Her lip didn't tremble. Instead, she let out a soft, almost imperceptible breath. It wasn't a sigh of defeat. It was the sound of a woman letting go of 3 years of careful restraint. The subservient, invisible waitress persona melted away, replaced by the sharp, brilliant forensic accountant who had once tracked millions of dollars in dark money across international borders. She slowly looked up, meeting Richard Croft's gaze. The billionaire's smug smile faltered slightly. The look in her eyes wasn't the look of a victim. It was the look of an executioner. $1, Chloe said. Her voice was no longer the soft, hushed tone of a server. It was clear, resonant, and carried a chilling authority that echoed through the quiet restaurant. "You are absolutely right, Mr. Croft. A person's true worth should be heavily scrutinized." Croft's brow furrowed. This was not the script. "Excuse me?" he snapped. "Are you talking back to me? Where is your manager? I want you fired immediately." David, the manager, started to rush forward, his face pale with panic, but Chloe held up a single, commanding hand without even looking at him. Shockingly, David stopped in his tracks, paralyzed by the sheer force of her sudden authority. "Before you leave, Mr. Croft," Chloe said, reaching into the pocket of her black apron. She didn't pull out a napkin or a corkscrew. She pulled out a sleek, red ink fountain pen. "I believe I owe you some change, because $1 is vastly undervaluing what I have to offer you tonight." She picked up the $1 bill. She smoothed it out on the table, right next to his signed credit card slip. She uncapped her red pen. "What the hell are you doing?" Penelope Vane whispered, her voice laced with confusion. Chloe didn't answer. With swift, deliberate strokes, she began to write across the face of the dollar bill. She didn't write an insult. She didn't write a plea. She wrote a string of very specific letters and numbers. When she was finished, she capped the pen, slipped it back into her apron, and slid the dollar bill back across the table, stopping it exactly an inch from Croft's hand. "Keep the tip, Richard," Chloe said softly. Her use of his first name sent a visible shockwave through his entourage. "I think you're going to need it to pay your legal fees." Croft let out a scoffing laugh, trying to reassert his dominance. "You are insane. You are a mentally unstable waitress who—" His voice died in his throat as his eyes drifted down to the dollar bill. The red ink practically glowed against the green paper. "Project Icarus, Grand Cayman, account 8802-VTC-9. In less than a second, the arrogant, flushed color drained entirely from Richard Croft's face, leaving him looking like a reanimated corpse. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hands, previously resting casually by his sides, suddenly began to shake violently. "What did you write?" Jonathan Hayes asked, leaning over to look. Before Jonathan could read it, Croft practically slammed his hand down on the dollar bill, snatching it off the table and crumpling it in his fist. He looked up at Chloe, and for the first time in his life, Richard Croft looked genuinely, unequivocally terrified. "How?" Croft choked out, the word barely a whisper. Sweat beaded on his forehead. "How do you know that?" "I know a lot of things," Chloe said, leaning in slightly, her voice dropping to a deadly, intimate whisper, meant only for him. "I know that 3 years ago, when you gutted Matthew's logistics, you didn't just liquidate the assets. You siphoned $72 million of union pension funds into a shell company in the Caymans. You called it Project Icarus. My father couldn't prove it before the stress killed him. But I did. I am Arthur Matthews' daughter, Richard, and I've spent the last 3 years following the money you thought was invisible." Croft's chest heaved. He looked around wildly, suddenly realizing that the restaurant wasn't his kingdom anymore. It was a trap. "You have no proof," he hissed, spittle flying from his lips. "You're a nobody. You're serving food to people who matter." "I was serving," Chloe corrected him calmly. She reached up and unpinned her name tag, dropping it onto the silver tray with a sharp clink. "My shift just ended." She reached into her other pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted USB drive, holding it up between her thumb and forefinger. "I have the ledger, Richard. Every wire transfer, every forged signature. I know about the bribes to the local officials in Delaware. I know about the tax evasion. And more importantly," she paused, letting the silence hang heavy, "the SEC knows. I sent the decrypted files to the Securities and Exchange Commission and directly to the New York Times exactly 10 minutes ago, right around the time you made me pick up your butter knife." "You're lying," Croft gasped, stumbling backward, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He bumped into Jonathan, almost knocking the other man over. "You're a liar." "Check your phone," Chloe suggested gently, tilting her head. As if on cue, the silence of the restaurant was shattered by a sound. It wasn't the clinking of glasses, it was the sharp, urgent buzzing of a cell phone. But it wasn't just Croft's phone. Jonathan Hayes's phone began to ring. Then Penelope Vane's. Across the room, at the table of a prominent hedge fund manager, another phone lit up. Within seconds, a cacophony of rings, pings, and frantic notifications erupted across the dining room as news alerts hit the wire. The digital avalanche had begun. The financial world was waking up to the biggest corporate fraud scandal of the decade, and the epicenter was standing right in front of them. Croft pulled his phone from his pocket with a trembling hand. The screen was illuminated with a half-dozen missed calls from his chief legal counsel, his PR director, and an urgent news push notification that read, "Breaking, SEC raids. Croft Holdings over alleged $70 million pension fraud." The billionaire dropped his phone. It hit the floor, the screen cracking in a spiderweb pattern. The sound of Richard Croft's titanium-encased smartphone hitting the hardwood floor of Lorkey was quiet. But in the suffocating silence of the dining room, it sounded like a judge's gavel. The spiderweb crack on the screen mirrored the sudden, violent fracturing of Croft's reality. For 5 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The waitstaff remained paralyzed, trays of foie gras and champagne suspended in midair. The elite patrons, masters of the universe, who usually controlled the flow of global capital, were reduced to panicked spectators. Jonathan Hayes was the first to break the tableau. The real estate mogul's normally flushed, jovial face had gone the color of spoiled milk. He lunged for his own vibrating phone resting on the white tablecloth, his thick fingers fumbling to unlock the screen. "Richard!" Jonathan gasped, his voice tight with rising hysteria. "Richard, my broker just texted me. Croft Holdings stock is in freefall. They've halted trading on the after-hours exchange. What the hell did you do?" Croft didn't answer Jonathan. He couldn't take his eyes off Chloe. The billionaire's breathing was shallow and ragged. The man who had spent the last 2 hours treating her like a subservient insect was now staring at her as if she were a ghost holding a loaded gun to his chest. "You," Croft stammered, the smooth, authoritative baritone of his voice completely gone, replaced by a desperate rasp. "You don't have the authority. You're a waitress. You pour water." "I poured water for 3 years, Richard," Chloe said, her voice remaining impossibly steady. She didn't raise her volume. She didn't have to. The entire room was hanging on her every word. "I poured water, I wiped tables, and I listened. You people are so arrogant. You think the staff is deaf. You think we're furniture. You sat in this very restaurant at table 9 6 months ago and bragged to your offshore banker about funneling the Delaware bribes through a shell corporation called Vanguard Logistics. You practically gave me the routing numbers between your appetizers and your main course." Penelope Vane let out a sharp gasp, a perfectly manicured hand flying to her mouth. She grabbed her crocodile skin handbag from the empty chair beside her, her eyes darting toward the exit. "Richard, I cannot be associated with this," she whispered frantically. "My charity gala is next week. If the press links me to a federal raid—" "Sit down, Penelope," Croft roared, a sudden burst of primal panic breaking through his shock. He slammed his fist onto the table, making the fine china rattle. "Nobody is leaving." He turned back to Chloe, his face contorting into a mask of desperate, feral negotiation. The bully had been cornered, and his only remaining instinct was to buy his way out. "Listen to me," Croft said, his tone shifting rapidly from rage to a sickeningly artificial calm. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek leather checkbook. "Whatever they are paying you, whatever sick revenge fantasy you think you're playing out, it stops now. We are businessmen. We are reasonable people. You are Arthur Matthews's daughter? Fine. I acquired his company legally. You forged the asset valuations and bribed the union leaders to strike, plunging the stock into the ground so you could buy it for pennies," Chloe corrected him, her eyes burning with a cold blue fire. "My father died of a massive coronary 2 weeks after you finalized the hostile takeover. You didn't just steal his company, Richard. You stole his life." "I will give you $5 million, Croft blurted out, ignoring her completely. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely uncap his pen. $5 million. Right here, right now. You call the SEC. You tell them the files you sent were a hoax, a disgruntled employee's fabrication. I will wire the money into an offshore account tonight. You'll never have to carry a tray again." A murmur rippled through the surrounding tables. $5 million. It was an astronomical sum, offered as casually as one might offer to cover a bar tab. David, the restaurant manager, was visibly sweating, his eyes darting between Chloe and the checkbook. Chloe looked at the checkbook, then up at Croft's terrified, sweating face. She felt a profound, overwhelming sense of pity mixed with disgust. $5 million, Chloe echoed softly. She reached out and placed her hand over his trembling fingers, stopping the pen before it could touch the paper. "Richard, do you honestly believe there is a dollar amount that can buy back the sleep my mother lost? Or the dignity you stripped from the hundreds of warehouse workers whose pensions you stole?" She leaned in closer, the scent of his expensive cologne mixing with the sharp tang of his fear sweat. "I don't want your money," she whispered. "I want your empire, and as of 10 minutes ago, I already have it." "You arrogant little—" Croft hissed, yanking his hand away from hers as if he had been burned. He turned wildly to his guests. "Jonathan, call Sullivan. Get my legal team on the line immediately. We need an injunction against the Times. We need to freeze all statements." But Jonathan Hayes wasn't moving to help him. The real estate developer was staring at his own phone, his face a portrait of utter devastation. "Jonathan," Croft barked. "My accounts," Jonathan whispered, his voice trembling violently. He slowly looked up, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrific realization. "My Cayman accounts, they're frozen. The bank just sent an automated flag." Croft froze. "What are you talking about?" "The Delaware Project," Jonathan practically screamed, leaping out of his chair. He pointed a trembling finger at Croft. "You told me the Vanguard routing was secure. You told me it was clean money. If the SEC has the Vanguard ledger, they have my name next to the zoning bribes." "Calm down, you idiot," Croft yelled back. "We have plausible deniability." "There is no deniability, Mr. Hayes," Chloe interjected smoothly. She took a step back from the table, giving them space to tear each other apart. "When I decrypted the Project Icarus files, I didn't just find Richard's offshore holdings. I found the master spreadsheet. It meticulously details every kickback, every bribe, and every co-conspirator. You are the second name on the list, Jonathan, right below Richard's." Chaos erupted at table 4. Jonathan lunged forward, grabbing Croft by the lapels of his $15,000 suit. "You son of a bitch!" Jonathan roared, spittle flying into Croft's face. "I trusted you. I leveraged my entire portfolio on this. Get your hands off me." Croft shoved Jonathan backward. The larger man stumbled, crashing into a nearby serving cart. A tower of crystal champagne flutes toppled, shattering against the hardwood floor with a deafening crash. The sound broke the final seal of decorum in the restaurant. Patrons at nearby tables began to stand up, throwing cash onto their tables and rushing toward the exits. The illusion of the untouchable elite had been shattered, and nobody wanted to be caught in the blast radius of a federal raid. Penelope Vane didn't even look back. She shoved past a stunned waiter, her high heels clicking frantically against the floor as she bolted for the private elevator. "Security!" David, the manager, finally found his voice, shrieking toward the front desk. "Call security." Croft was breathing heavily, his suit jacket rumpled, his hair disheveled. He looked around the rapidly emptying restaurant, watching his peers, the people who had kissed his ring just an hour ago, fleeing as if he were carrying a deadly virus. He turned back to Chloe, his eyes manic. "You think you did this alone?" Croft sneered, though his voice lacked any real conviction. It was the desperate thrashing of a drowning man. "You're a waitress. You don't have the clearance to bypass the biometric firewalls at Croft Holdings. Someone gave you the keys. Who was it? Who betrayed me?" Chloe offered a small, terrifyingly serene smile. "You betrayed yourself, Richard. You built an entire company on a foundation of absolute terror. You demanded loyalty, but you only inspired fear. And the problem with ruling by fear is that the second your subordinates see a way out, they will take it." She crossed her arms over her black apron. "I didn't hack your servers. I didn't need to. For the past 6 months, I've been anonymously mailing physical copies of the internal discrepancies to your chief financial officer, Gregory Harrison." Croft's eyes widened to the size of saucers. "Gregory? No! Gregory is completely loyal. He's spineless." "Exactly," Chloe nodded. "He is spineless. When I showed him the undeniable proof of the pension fraud, I also left a note suggesting that the FBI was already circling. I made him believe he was the primary target. I used the exact same psychological torture you used on him for 10 years. Gregory panicked. He realized that if he didn't flip, you would make him the fall guy." Croft stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of his chair. "Gregory didn't just give me the decryption keys," Chloe continued, her voice echoing in the nearly empty dining room. "He filed an official whistleblower complaint with the SEC 48 hours ago to secure federal immunity for himself. He handed them the servers, Richard. Tonight was just the release of the embargo. I wanted to look you in the eye when the clock ran out. A profound, suffocating silence fell over Richard Croft, the fight completely drained out of him. He sank down into his chair, a hollow, broken shell of a man. The sheer magnitude of his defeat, orchestrated by the invisible woman pouring his water, was too immense for his brain to process. From the street level, 70 stories below, the faint but unmistakable wail of police sirens began to rise through the Manhattan night, growing louder and more frantic by the second. Chloe walked over to the table. She picked up the crumpled, faded $1 bill that Croft had thrown in her face. She smoothed it out carefully, placing it neatly next to his signed credit card receipt. "Your change, Mr. Croft," Chloe whispered. Without another word, Chloe Matthews turned her back on the ruined billionaire. She untied her black apron, draped it over the mahogany service station, and walked toward the staff elevator. Her feet still throbbed, and her shift had been exhausting, but for the first time in 3 years, she felt incredibly, wonderfully light. The wail of the sirens grew from a distant, haunting echo into a deafening roar that vibrated the heavy, soundproofed glass of Lorchidee. Red and blue lights strobed wildly across the ceiling of the dining room, reflecting off the shattered champagne flutes and the abandoned crystal glasses. The sanctuary of the elite had officially been breached. Down on the street level, the scene was absolute chaos. 6 black SUVs bearing the golden seal of the FBI and the SEC had violently swerved onto the curb, blocking the entrance to the high-rise. Heavily armed federal agents poured into the lobby, moving with practiced, ruthless efficiency. This was not a quiet, white-collar inquiry. Because of the sheer scale of the pension theft and the flight risk posed by a billionaire with offshore resources, the Department of Justice had opted for a theatrical, deeply public takedown. Chloe stepped out of the service elevator and into the bustling kitchen. The culinary staff was huddled around a small television, usually reserved for checking ingredient deliveries. The channel was tuned to CNBC. Andrew Ross Sorkin was mid-sentence, looking visibly stunned as a breaking news banner flashed across the bottom of the screen in aggressive red block letters. "We are getting live reports from Midtown Manhattan," Sorkin announced, pressing an earpiece into his ear. "Federal agents are currently raiding the corporate headquarters of Croft Holdings. This follows a massive, unprecedented data dump sent directly to the SEC, the Justice Department, and multiple news outlets, alleging that CEO Richard Croft orchestrated a $72 million pension fraud scheme linked to the hostile takeover of Matthews Logistics 3 years ago. Sources indicate a whistleblower from inside Croft's inner circle provided the encrypted ledgers." Chloe untied her hair, letting the severe, invisible bun fall loose around her shoulders. She slipped out the back exit, the cool night air hitting her flushed face. She didn't stay to watch the finale, but the entire world did. 10 minutes later, cell phone footage flooded Twitter and international news networks. It showed Richard Croft, the untouchable titan of private equity, being marched out of the gleaming glass lobby of the high-rise. He wasn't wearing his bespoke suit jacket. It had been left behind in the panic. His hands were securely zip-tied behind his back. The arrogance that usually radiated from him was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, wide-eyed stare of a trapped animal. Jonathan Hayes was led out right behind him, weeping openly as the flashbulbs of paparazzi cameras exploded like lightning in the dark. For Chloe, the flashing lights faded as she descended into the subway. The train ride to Queens was a blur. She sat in the corner of a graffiti-scarred subway car, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks matching the pounding of her heart. When she finally turned the key in the lock of her modest 2-bedroom apartment, the smell of cheap chicken broth and stale medicine greeted her. It was 1,000,000 miles away from the white truffles of Lochide. "Chloe, is that you, sweetheart?" A frail voice called out from the bedroom. Chloe walked in. Her mother, Martha Matthews, was propped up on a mountain of pillows, an oxygen tube resting gently beneath her nose. The stress of Arthur's death and the subsequent financial ruin had ravaged her health, leaving her needing a high-risk cardiac surgery they could never afford. "I'm home, Mum," Chloe said, her voice cracking for the first time all night. She sat on the edge of the bed and took her mother's thin, paper-like hand. Martha looked closely at her daughter's face in the dim light of the bedside lamp. "You look different. Did something happen at the restaurant? Did that awful manager yell at you again?" A tear finally spilled over Chloe's eyelashes, tracking hotly down her cheek, but she was smiling. It was a fierce, radiant smile. "No, Mom, nobody yelled at me. Actually, Dad's company, the men who took it." Martha's breath caught. "What about them, Chloe?" "They're gone," Chloe whispered, squeezing her mother's hand. "It's over. We finally got them." The Daniel Patrick Moynihan United States Courthouse in Lower Manhattan is a towering, imposing structure of granite and glass, designed to make anyone who enters it feel remarkably small. But as Chloe Matthews walked through the heavy oak doors of Courtroom 14B on a crisp Tuesday morning in November, she had never felt larger. It had been 9 excruciating months since the spectacular public implosion of Richard Croft at Lochide. The resulting trial, officially docketed as the United States versus Richard Croft, had become an international media sensation. Financial news networks ran wall-to-wall coverage, detailing how a seemingly untouchable private equity titan had systematically looted the pensions of thousands of blue-collar workers. Richard Croft sat at the heavy mahogany defense table. The Federal Holding Center in Brooklyn had stripped him of his terrifying aura. He was no longer the apex predator of Wall Street. His bespoke Italian suits had been confiscated, replaced by an ill-fitting, standard-issue grey suit provided by his legal team. His silver hair, once perfectly coiffed, was thinning and lacked its usual luster. He looked incredibly old, his skin holding a pale, sickly pallor under the harsh, fluorescent lights of the courtroom. Beside him sat his lead defense attorney, Charles Pendleton, a $3,000 an hour bulldog known for destroying witnesses on cross-examination. Pendleton's entire strategy rested on one singular, desperate pillar: discrediting the whistleblower. Chloe took the witness stand. She wore a sharp, perfectly tailored charcoal blazer. Her posture was impeccable, a stark contrast to the slouched, invisible server Richard had mocked just a year prior. Assistant United States Attorney David Corrin, a meticulously prepared prosecutor, spent the morning guiding Chloe through the labyrinthine financial ledgers. With the clinical, devastating precision of a master forensic accountant, Chloe explained exactly how Croft had manipulated asset valuations, forced Matthews' logistics into artificial insolvency, and siphoned $72 million into offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands under the alias Project Icarus. Then it was Pendleton's turn. The defense attorney approached the podium with a predatory smile, adjusting his silk tie. He intended to paint Chloe not as a brilliant investigator, but as a grieving, unstable daughter obsessed with a vendetta. "Miss Matthews," Pendleton began, his voice dripping with condescension, "you expect this jury to believe that you, a waitress pouring sparkling water and scraping plates for a living, somehow unraveled a global financial network that bypassed the internal audits of a multi-billion-dollar firm." Chloe did not flinch. She leaned slightly toward the microphone. "I expect the jury to look at the data, Mr. Pendleton. The numbers do not care about my previous occupation." But your occupation is highly relevant, isn't it? Pendleton countered, pacing in front of the jury box. You weren't acting as an impartial auditor. You were a disgruntled, grieving daughter. Your father, Arthur Matthews, tragically took his own life after his company failed. Isn't it true that you suffered a severe mental breakdown, dropped out of the corporate world, and took a menial job simply to stalk my client? A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Richard Croft offered a faint, smug smirk, believing his high-priced lawyer had finally drawn blood. Chloe looked directly at Croft, then back to Pendleton. She felt the old rage flare, but she channeled it into absolute, freezing calm. I took a job in the service industry because my mother was dying of heart failure. Our accounts had been illegally frozen by your client's hostile takeover tactics, and I needed flexible hours to be her primary caregiver, Chloe stated, her voice echoing clearly across the silent courtroom. As for the financial network, I didn't somehow unravel it. I utilized standard forensic data mining. I applied Benford's law to the anomalous invoice patterns originating from Croft Holdings' Delaware subsidiaries. The mathematical probability of those specific numeric sequences occurring naturally in a legitimate ledger is less than 1 in 14 billion. The money was artificially layered, Mr. Pendleton. It was sloppy. Mr. Croft wasn't a genius. He was just a bully who assumed no one would ever dare to look. Pendleton's smile vanished. He tried to pivot, pulling out a printed email. But you illegally accessed these files. Objection! Prosecutor Corrin interrupted, standing up. The witness has already testified that the encrypted ledgers were legally handed over to federal authorities by Croft Holdings' own chief financial officer, Gregory Harrison, who secured whistleblower immunity. Sustained, Judge Miriam Rostova ruled, peering over her reading glasses at the defense attorney. Move on, Mr. Pendleton. You are losing the thread. For the next 2 hours, Chloe systematically dismantled every trap Pendleton laid. She didn't argue with emotion. She argued with routing numbers, time-stamped wire transfers, and undeniable hard evidence. By the time Pendleton finally sat down, his face was flushed, and Richard Croft was staring at the table, his hands trembling slightly. 3 days later, the jury was sent to deliberate. They returned in less than 4 hours. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the scratch of the court reporter's stenotype machine. The jury foreman, an older woman with sharp eyes, stood up and held a piece of paper. On the first count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, the foreman read, her voice steady. We find the defendant, Richard Croft, guilty. Croft squeezed his eyes shut. On the second count of securities fraud, guilty. On the third count of racketeering, guilty. Count after count, 47 in total, fell upon Richard Croft like the blows of a hammer. When the final guilty verdict was read, Judge Rostova did not waste time. She looked down at the former billionaire with an expression of profound disgust. Mr. Croft, Judge Rostova said, her voice carrying the absolute weight of the law. You built an empire not on innovation, but on the systematic destruction of working-class families. You stole their security, you stole their dignity, and you did it simply because you believed your wealth made you untouchable. It is the judgment of this court that you be remanded immediately to federal custody to serve a sentence of 35 years. A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. 35 years. For a man of his age, it was a definitive life sentence. 2 U.S. Marshals stepped forward. Croft tried to stand, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no sound came out. The definitive metallic click of the handcuffs echoing around his wrists was the final punctuation mark on his ruined life. Justice, however, was only one side of the coin. The other side was restitution. Under the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, the Securities and Exchange Commission is mandated to heavily reward whistleblowers who provide original, timely information, leading to successful enforcement actions exceeding $1 million. Because Chloe's meticulous, undeniable data had directly resulted in the complete recovery of the stolen $72 million in pension funds, plus over $100 million in civil penalties levied against Croft's accomplices, her statutory reward was unprecedented. 2 weeks after the sentencing, Chloe sat in a sterile, glass-walled conference room at the SEC regional office. A senior director slid a thick folder across the table. "The Commission has authorized the maximum allowable percentage under the statute, Miss Matthews," the director said with a respectful nod. 30% of the recovered sanctions. The wire transfer has cleared this morning. $21.6 million, post-tax. Chloe stared at the document. She didn't celebrate. She simply pulled out a pen, signed her name, and stood up. Her first stop was Mount Sinai Hospital. Martha Matthews was resting in a private, sunlit recovery suite overlooking Central Park. The high-risk cardiac surgery, which had been performed by the top cardiothoracic surgeon in the country, was a complete success. The crushing weight of medical debt that had hovered over them for years had been wiped out with a single phone call to the billing department. Chloe sat on the edge of the bed, holding her mother's warm, steady hand. The rhythmic, healthy beeping of the heart monitor was the most beautiful sound Chloe had ever heard. "The doctors said I can go home next week," Martha smiled, her cheeks finally holding a healthy flush of color. "And you, my brilliant girl, what are you going to do now? You have the freedom to do anything. Go to Paris. Start your own firm." Chloe looked out the window at the sprawling Manhattan skyline. "I already know exactly what I'm going to do, Mum. I'm going to fix what he broke." The biting, late November wind whipped across the vast tarmac of the Newark logistics hub. The massive commercial yard, capable of housing hundreds of freight trucks, had sat dormant and rusting since Croft had liquidated Matthews Logistics. Chloe stood near the main gate, her coat pulled tight against the cold. Behind her, a brand-new sign was being hoisted onto the main warehouse building by a construction crew. It didn't read Croft Holdings. The bold blue lettering proudly spelled out Matthews Logistics and Freight. Approaching her across the cracked asphalt was a large crowd. There were over 60 people, men and women in heavy work jackets, flannel shirts, and boots. They were the truck drivers, the loading dock workers, and the dispatchers who had been brutally cast aside 3 years ago. At the front of the group walked Thomas, her father's former floor foreman. His thick grey beard was wind-blown, and he looked at Chloe with a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming hope. Beside him was Brenda, the former head of dispatch, clutching a manila folder filled with employment documents. "Miss Matthews," Thomas said, taking off his woolen cap. "We all got the certified letters. The attorneys said our pensions are being fully restored with back interest. Everyone gets their retirement back." "That's just the beginning, Thomas," Chloe said, her voice clear and strong over the howling wind. "I used a portion of the SEC whistleblower fund to purchase this entire facility and its operational licenses at the Federal Asset Forfeiture Auction. I bought it back from the government." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a heavy ring of brass keys. "My father built this company on the belief that a business is only as strong as the people who run it," Chloe continued, looking around at the emotional faces of the workers. "Croft looked at you and saw numbers on a spreadsheet that he could erase to line his own pockets. He was wrong. And starting Monday morning, we are reopening the doors." Brenda let out a choked sob, covering her mouth with her hand. Several of the burly truck drivers wiped their eyes, the heavy burden of the past 3 years suddenly lifting from their shoulders. Chloe held the keys out to Thomas. "I need my floor foreman back, Thomas. And Brenda, I need dispatch running at full capacity by the end of the month. Are you in?" Thomas stared at the keys. His rough, calloused hand reached out, shaking slightly as he took them from her grasp. He looked up, a fierce, protective pride shining in his eyes. "Arthur would be so damn proud of you, Chloe," Thomas whispered, gripping the keys tightly. "We're in. All of us. Let's get to work." As the workers crowded around, cheering and embracing each other, Chloe took a step back. She closed her eyes, letting the freezing wind wash over her. She thought back to the suffocating smell of truffles at l'Orchidée. She thought of the $15,000 bill, the unbearable arrogance in Richard Croft's eyes, and that singular, faded $1 bill he had thrown at her feet to break her spirit. He had tipped her $1 because he genuinely believed that was all she would ever be worth. He never realized that in his desperate need to humiliate her, he had given her the exact motivation required to burn his empire to the ground and build her family's legacy back from the ashes. The invisible server had become the architect of his destruction and the architect of her own incredible rebirth. Power is rarely defined by the balance in a bank account. It is defined by the absolute resilience of the human spirit. Richard Croft believed his immense wealth granted him the divine right to crush the working class, confusing a person's temporary occupation with their permanent intellect. By weaponizing a $1 tip to humiliate a waitress, he blinded himself to the lethal danger standing right in front of him. Chloe Matthews weaponized her invisibility. She endured the agonizing humiliation of the service industry, meticulously gathering the fragments of her father's stolen legacy, striking only when the trap was perfectly set. Ultimately, this story proves that arrogance is a fragile glass house. When those at the top forget that the people pouring their water, wiping their tables, and driving their trucks are observant, intelligent human beings, they invite their own spectacular ruin.